if we're going to improve outcomes for children, we want to move from where we are here in the blue world over into this lovely purple world. And at the moment, if you like, the front-end focus of what we're doing is this sifting process that leads to the administrative closure of a very significant amount of work, with us not really undertaking any assessment beyond what happens at the child abuse report line. And that's left with a bucket of things that we feel we have the capacity to have a closer look at, and the focus there is very much on investigations. There is a level of diversion to get those investigation numbers down, but the diversion is, if you like, by and large, a pretty soft diversion. And a small portion of those matters that come in, we substantiate abuse or neglect, and we do some more intensive work. We start with 55,000 phone calls a year to the child abuse report line. 35,000 of them, we write something down to say it's about a child well-being, a concern about a child. 20,000 of them we say are serious enough that they meet the statutory threshold that we should do something significant about them. We investigate 5,000 and we substantiate 2,000, and we remove about 300 to 400 children from their parents' care each year. We've got this massive juggernaut that's coming down to something quite intense for about 2,000 people. What we want to do into the future, and I'll talk about some of the things that we have already mapped out and want to start testing, is to really start with a diversionary mindset and linking families who have a need with a service that exists in the community, or alerting a service that they are already connected with that they might be in dire straits at this particular point in time. We've got all the tools to do that. We've got the information sharing guidelines. We've got some of the basic provisions in the Children's Protection Act. We just haven't organised ourselves to operate in that way, and that's part of what we want to do. Rather than taking, an investigative approach, though there will be a cohort of cases where a forensic investigation will still be required. Can't step away from that, but what we do want to do is take much more of an assessment-based approach, where we are also providing supports in the context of undertaking those assessments, and, if you like, providing brief intervention in that context. Because what we want to be able to do is actually, rather than identify faults in families and work out whether or not we're going to remove a child, which we will still need to do into the future, but rather than that be the overriding purpose and rationale for our involvement, really focusing on how can we strengthen families. And when we do all of that, having organised our workforce differently, the modelling we've done indicates that we can do more work in a more focused way. But there will still be some administrative closures at the end of that process. We do not have enough resources to do 100% of what we believe we should, but we can do a hell of a lot more than we are doing at the moment. The other thing that I just wanted to highlight to you is that we are looking to make the delivery arms of our organisation the bit that drives everything. Over a long period of time, our organisation, and I've been responsible for this for the last 5 years, every time something needs to be fixed, we tend to create a new little team, because we can't spread resources thinly across the whole of the state, that'll do a specialised little add-on function. And so that functional area of our organisation has grown and grown and grown. And the direct delivery, out of local offices has remained fairly static in terms of size. Certainly for the last sort of 5 to 8 years. And there has been, if you like, a growth in the corporate area as well, but mainly bringing in people to do practice-focused things. So, for those of you who know anything about public sector classifications, you would think in the corporate space you'd have 100% of people who are in the administrative services stream. We've got a lot of people who are in the allied health professional stream, because we've actually started to put some of those service delivery functions into that space. And what we want to do, and what we are doing with the structure, is actually moving all of that service delivery capacity into the delivery parts of our organisation. And what we want to do is really set some very clear KPIs for those delivery areas, very much in the same way that we set KPIs for our community sector partners who we fund, and monitor them in the same way. So that what we're saying is, we're not going to create a new little team to deal with this issue. We're going to support each and every office across the state to deliver on the core things that we as an organisation believe we ought to. And that's a fundamental shift for us as an organisation. It's going to take time for us to embed that as a new way of working, because I think we are very used to setting up these little teams, which ultimately actually don't address the problem that they set out to do. I think that's our learning from the last decade. You set up these sort of functional services, but they actually, by and large, don't deliver what we're looking for. Because in order to get what we want, get the outcomes we want at scale, it's got to become part of the DNA of our core practice each day, working with carers, working with families, working with children. So, what we're trying to do, and I'll talk about some of the things that we have done in each of these spaces already, is to create Families SA so that it's solution focused. Just as an example, we're taking some of the notions from solution-based casework and we're applying that in every bit of the business. And we want to start at the child abuse report line. Any of you called the child abuse report line in the last 6 months or so? Yeah, a few people nodding around the room. What we're doing by and large is getting information about an incident, about an event that is causing some considerable concern for the notifier about harm or the risk of harm to a child. We're going to continue to do that. That's absolutely core to what we do. But there are 4 questions, if you like, that we're going to add to the script that we're going to ask. And the first one is, what do you think's going well for the family? Actually trying to get a sense of, we very rarely ask that question. Sometimes it's volunteered by the notifier, but we don't routinely seek that information out. Now, into the future, we are going to be routinely seeking that information and documenting it, because we want to start planning right from that point. What are the things that we can start doing to support that family, strengthen that family? The second question is, do you know of any resources or supports that you as the notifier can draw on for this family? And we sometimes ask that question these days, but Again, we're going to do it in a much more structured way. Because very often, the notifier, particularly if they're a professional from a mandated notifier from a professional, from a profession working in an organisation that delivers services to families and children, can actually do some things that mean that dragging this family into the statutory child protection system isn't necessary. And given that there are about 15,000 notifications a year that do not meet the statutory threshold, that's a group of people for whom this question, I think, will be really important, and what the conversation that then flows from that. The other question is, do you know of other services or service sectors that would be helpful? Effectively, do you know about other services that this family is involved with? And what are you willing to do? And while I don't want to play this up too much, the Children's Protection Act is very clear that making a notification does not result in a professional's duty of care to a family being discharged, if you like. And the more we can get notifiers involved in supporting families, I think the better the outcomes for children, and I think the less risk of re-notification and of children being drawn deeper and deeper and their families drawn deeper and deeper into the child protection system. That's certainly been the experience in Minnesota, who've been using these 4 questions as part of their intake process for a number of years. We'll need to start gently with this so that we get the questioning right, and that so that notifiers don't feel like everything's just being pushed back onto them. But our experience with a small group of schools is that when you give notifiers a bit of knowledge, some understanding of the service system and an understanding of what they can do, they can and do, if you like, intervene protectively in sort of matters that are more about well-being than about abuse or neglect, and prevent the escalation and ultimately reduce the number of notifications they're making. So the logic of that trial with several schools in the northern suburbs, which is going to be expanded this year, we really want to apply to the whole service system. But as I say, we'll need to go gently. But we started to map this out, started to identify the types of cases where we will start trying this during 2014. And obviously, we'll also need to be thinking about how we can get some feedback about this. And we're going to need to think how we apply this in the context of e-CAL and online notification as well. I think there's some really exciting opportunities there. The second change that we want to bring about is, I suppose, increases in family resilience and support to families. And obviously diversion is one of the ways that we are looking to do that. If we've got a child protection notification coming from a school, and through those 4 questions, for example, we identify that an adult in the family, for example, is a client of mental health services. What we're wanting to do is create, and we're creating diversionary capacity, additional staff into the child abuse report line. So rather than just receiving that information, these people will be tasked with actually phoning the service providers with whom the family is connected, sharing some information with them as appropriate in accordance with the information sharing guidelines, and looking to see if together we can marshal some supports around that family. Because the service provider who's providing a critical support to the parents may in fact have no idea about the event that the notifier has just alerted us to. But with that information, their capacity to respond protectively and support their client in a slightly different way could be greatly enhanced. And that's the kind of space we want to move into with diversion. Over time, I think we are going to need to look to how we expand the range of diversion opportunities within the community. And that might mean some dedicated funding. But in the first instance, really what we want to focus on is how can we, simply by sharing information and providing, if you like, some education and some development to our partners and partner organisations, can we in fact get better outcomes for children and their families right up front. Another area where we are looking to focus on support and building resilience is around some of the family preservation work that we're doing, and I'll talk about that in a short while. The third area of change that we're really focusing on with the redesign is about bringing the elements together in a clearly articulated client journey. And some of that work that I referred to earlier of, moving away from the broad aspiration and the truckloads of procedures is about thinking about our system in terms of the client's journey. And, step by step, and almost asking a series of binary questions, or questions that have a binary answer, yes or no. And, we just start to think through what do we need to be doing, how do we need to be responding. In doing that, it's become really clear to us that, if you like, this very linear way in which we generally think about our system, intake, assessment, protective intervention, guardianship, and we've got some sort of modalities running across the top. And we do tend to think of our system in a very linear way. And in terms of doing some of our thinking and some of our planning, it's become very apparent to us that we've got to start thinking in a much more integrated way. Hence, the types of questions that we are looking to ask at the Child Abuse Report Line, those 4 questions from Minnesota, are really about positioning us and gathering information that right there at the intake phase that has implications and is linked with what we think we might need to do at all those other phases. Because at the moment, some of those strengths questions we don't even think about asking until we get into the investigation. But we might frame our investigation very, very differently. We might not do an investigation. We might look at a very different assessment approach if we're starting to ask some of those strengths questions right there at the beginning. Likewise, we have a very linear, drawn-out approach to get to a Guardianship 18 order. There are some cases, if you like, that are so white hot that, we ought to not be just, flapping about. We ought to be moving to a Guardianship 18 order very, very quickly. And again, we need to start thinking about how we construct everything in our system, that we identify those cases as early as possible and start responding appropriately. But likewise, we need to be identifying as early as possible those cases where investing time and energy in protective interventions, in strengthening the family and keeping the children out of the child protection system is what we're doing. At the moment, too often, we're on the evidence collecting path for quite some time, and a whole lot of procedural steps we're going through before we even think about linking a family with supports, with therapy, with intervention. Solution-based casework and a recalibrating, a redesign of our procedures, of our systems, will mean that we should be, and hopefully will be, linking families with interventions from day one of our assessment. If there are drug and alcohol problems, let's not wait till the end of a 42-day investigation and assessment order and we've got a 12-month order before we start referring a family to drug and alcohol services. Let's get them in there from day one. Now, our best practitioners do that, but we haven't institutionalised processes and procedures to ensure that that is routine. And that's part of what we're wanting to do here. So, really thinking about the client's journey is central to this, and thinking about it in a way that is not linear, but is cognizant of the entire system that can touch upon their lives. But doing that in a way where we are, for the maximum number of children and families, looking for an early exit to our system. The longer people stay connected with the child protection system, the more likely children are to come into care, and the longer children stay in care, the more likely they are to stay till they're 18. Now, this isn't about just, pushing out children who are and families who are in dire need, but it really is about thinking, how do we intervene protectively as quickly as possible, and do that in collaboration with a whole lot of partner organisations across the service system, so that we get, if you like, the statutory welfare into the background pretty quickly and out of the picture within a few months wherever possible. In terms of our change, already highlighted several times, big part of this is about investing in a specialising approach. And the hubs, which I've spoken about, and really wanting to say that we're going to focus on our core care and protection responsibilities. Very often when bureaucrats like me start talking about core business, that can be code for doing less. What I want to assure you is that the modelling that we've done has really been all driven towards how can we use the reasonable resources that we have to do more, and recognise that our core business is not 350 to 400 12-month orders. It's not just 2,700 children in care. It is actually probably somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 children and families each year that we want to provide some very significant supports and services to. Still not the 20,000 that notionally we'd probably like to be able to get to, but it's a lot more than the 2,000 that we're really talking about at this point in time. This is how we've physically organised things in terms of hubs and specialising teams. And on your way out today, there is a handout that's got a list of those locations and who the manager is, because there has been some changes in managers, so that's something to just assist you. Within the context of those specialising teams and specialising hubs, we're really looking to allocate, or we have allocated, a financial counsellor or two to each of those locations, and really wanting to see, particularly at the protective intervention phase and the assessment and support phase, using those financial counselling resources, particularly in those neglect cases. And a much more sharper focus on volunteerism, volunteer management, and really supporting the volunteers that we do have in those locations. The volunteers we've got do an enormous amount of work, and some of the volunteers are the most consistent people in the lives of some children in care. And we tend to use the most for transporting children to access. And I think there's a lot more that we can, in fact, a lot more functions, if you like, that we can identify that can be performed by volunteers to support children and young people. And, you know, certainly by having a much crisper focus on volunteerism and volunteer management, I'm hopeful over the next couple of years that we can, for example, increase the number of volunteer mentors that we have available to us, and for them not just to be for children on long-term orders, but in fact how we can actually use volunteer mentors at that protective intervention phase. In that context, in order to give that sort of support a longer tail and some consistency for those children and families, over time we're going to need to start talking with people in the community services sector about how we create you know, a whole system that provides that type of support. But to start with, we recognise we need to get our own house in order in this space, and a big part of what we're doing is that. In really stark, broad brush terms, at the moment, it could be said that by and large what Families SA does is does an investigation, substantiates or doesn't substantiate abuse and neglect. At the really high end of things, provides you know, some pretty heavy duty intervention, which might include removal of children from their parents' care, or we close the case. And more recently, we've developed capacity through the Stronger Families, Safer Children program, and even more recently, through the continued funding of Family by Family, for us to provide some services in terms of protective intervention. I think there's a realisation that there's a cohort of families for whom those sorts of voluntary services aren't going to work. And in fact, our attempt at using voluntary type programs for those families, we found that children from those families were more likely to come into care than families we didn't provide any support to at all, who had exactly the same profile. And so what we've realised is that short, intensive, statutory-based family preservation work is part of what we need to be doing into the future. And we've created that capacity with the specialising hubs and teams. We've started working through what that will look like. An important next step in that is how it interfaces with Stronger Families, Safer Children programs, for example, because we need to see these services as part of a continuum. But what I do want to highlight is that, firstly, these family preservation teams or staff are sitting alongside and are going to be really closely linked with our reunification teams. that from a systems point of view, having our managers in these locations drive case allocation and case transfer is an important part of this. I think it'd be fair to say at the moment where, in terms of access to or transfer of cases to Stronger Families, Safer Children, or transfer of cases between Families SA offices, it's been driven by supervisors, and we have as many different approaches as we have supervisors, and probably even a few more, depending on the day of the week. What we want to do is actually get some consistency to this, and some very clear points of contact for everybody in the system about how this is going to work. When we first suggested this, one of my concerns was that the managers were going to go, oh my God, you're just loading us up with more and more work, this is going to be impossible. The response from the managers has been, this is fantastic. There'll be much less cleaning up to do over the fights between different people and different approaches, and it'll just be clear, crisp. Everyone will know what's happening, and we're going to be able to make this run much more smoothly. Part of the exit from this, as I've said, we'll be looking to the targeted early intervention programs under the Stronger Families, Safer Children program, and a range of other family supporting programs. One of the things that we are going to need to work through with people in the sector over the next several months is the implications of the fact that many of these families we will be seeking supervision orders for. Clear undertakings from the families that in the court that they will be doing and certain things behaving in particular ways. And while at that intensive front end of things, we will be closely supervising it. As we hand the cases on to others in the sector and in the system, we'll be looking for a level of supervision and reporting back on compliance with those undertakings. And again, that's going to require a different way of working and a maturity from ourselves and from the sector in terms of how we do that. But that's an important part of what we'll be proposing. These supervision orders involve undertakings given by the parent. Now, I suppose there is a level of coercion in that the alternative is the department, on the behalf of the minister, seeks the custody and guardianship of the child. But these are undertakings being given by the parent. And so we're going to need to think about, the Act clearly spells out, for example, that undertakings to submit oneself to random drug testing or to submit oneself to drug treatment, clearly described in the legislation. We don't use it that much. At least I'm not paying for that much random drug testing, so I'm assuming it's not happening very much. If it's happening, I'd be paying for it. We'd be proposing to use those sorts of provisions more. If we take that a step further, could we, should we, will we seek undertakings that that a parent is compliant with their medication regime for psychotropic drugs? That they will remain engaged with disability services, that they will participate in domestic violence programs. Under what circumstances will we seek those sorts of undertakings, and how do we monitor them are going to be really important things for us to work through with quite a number of parties that are represented in this room. And but that's the implication for us going down this path. it will only work. We will only be able to preserve families and strengthen families without bringing children into care if we actually have those sorts of undertakings and have the capacity to monitor them. Now, people at various stages, and I'm sure some of you have heard me say this before, this sort of approach is very intrusive in the lives of families, and it is. But from my perspective, it is significantly less intrusive than the state intervening and removing the children from their parents' care and taking guardianship away from the parents, or seeking a court order taking the guardianship away. And so we've got to work out what are the right contexts in which to use this level of intrusion, and that's something that we'll certainly be working through in the coming months. And obviously, when we start looking to organisations and sectors that are represented in this room in terms of monitoring, we're going to have some very robust conversations. Finally, the other change that we really want to focus on is ensuring therapeutic interventions add value. A lot of the interventions that we currently provide that have a sort of a therapeutic badge attached to them are still incredibly assessment focused, and we do need to think quite differently about this. Also, and the New South Wales Ombudsman has been particularly critical in this space of services funded in the child protection space. Too often, the services are fairly generic family support, parenting support programs, when the core problems are drug and alcohol, mental health, domestic violence. And so we've really got to make sure that we are focused on the things that are going to make a difference. We need to target those interventions to the families where it is going to make a difference. It's got to be meaningful to the family, otherwise they're not going to engage with it. And certainly in keeping with our commitment to solution-based casework, it's got to be family-focused and it's got to be solution-centred. And so rethinking, for example, the way in which our psych services area operates is going to be fundamental to this. It is a classic case of some really dedicated, competent people who are spending almost all of their time doing assessment and virtually none of their time providing any therapeutic interventions. And we need to tip that on its head, not just at the child protection end of the business, but also at the guardianship end of the business. And a lot of that therapeutic intervention, I think, does need to be working with carers and supporting them and educating them so that they can, if you like, interact therapeutically with the children in their care. And turning that battleship around is going to be no small feat, but there is a real commitment, one level excitement and another level trepidation from our psych services area, in fact, to move in this direction. But it's not just psych services. It's every aspect of what we're doing. We want to have this notion that through therapeutic interventions we are adding value, not just gathering more information or further insight into the problem, but we are adding value to the lives of children and families. I mean, all of these things really are about trying to drive to measurable positive outcomes for children and families.